Good morning, everyone, and warm welcome to our conference, When Youth Take the Floor, a generational shift in political communication. My name is Panka Kirai, and I'm a student here at MCC School of Social Sciences and History, and it is my great pleasure to be your host for today. We're here to tackle a paradox. Young people are portrayed as disengaged, yet they're more values-driven and mobilized than ever. The reason? The spaces of political engagement have fundamentally shifted to digital platforms. Today, we will answer core questions like, how do we understand these new methods of engagement? What messaging resonates with digital youth, and who's leading the generational shift? We have a packed and crucial agenda ahead of us. Therefore, to begin, it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Georgina Kiss-Kozma, Deputy Director of the Youth Research Institute, who will now provide the foundational overview to officially set the stage for today. Please welcome Georgina Kiss-Kozma.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited to share some insight into how young people in Hungary connected with politics and public affairs. These findings come from the latest 2025 survey by the Youth Research Institute, which gives us a clear picture of the attitudes and behaviors of Hungarians aged 15 to 39, a generation that is steadily becoming a powerful voice in shaping our public conversation. Let me begin with a few words about the research itself. Our sample included 1,000 Hungarian young people aged 15 to 39. The data is representative by gender, age, level of education, settlement, type, and region. This gives us a very solid base to understand how younger generations see politics, how they communicate, and where the generational differences appear most strongly. Recent empirical studies in Hungary have portrayed young people as conformist rather than rebellious. When analyzing the public and political interest of Hungarian youth over the last 2 decades, we have repeatedly found that the passivity is one of the most important characteristics of the younger generations, alongside uncertainty and conformity. We also refer to them as the new silent generation, because in Hungary only a small proportion of 18 to 29-year-olds are interested in politics, and half of those surveyed are not interested in politics at all. On the other hand, according to the results of Hungarian youth research, two-thirds of Hungarian young people are potentially mobilizable for the parliamentary elections, and the political interest of young people is also increasing, which can be attributed to the consequences of the COVID pandemic. This is due to the fact that the young people talked more about political issues with their families during the lockdown. For decades, the political socialization of young people was shaped primarily by the family. This is why it is particularly interesting to examine what young people think about this today. One core question we looked at is, do young people agree with their parents? When we look specifically at politics, the picture becomes noticeably more divided. Only 54% of young people say they generally agree with their parents on political issues. This is one of the lowest agreement levels across the topics. At the same time, 35% openly disagree, which is a significantly higher disagreement rate than it in areas like finances, lifestyle, or parenting. So politics clearly stands out as an area where opinions drift apart more easily. While there is still a slim majority who agree with their parents, the level of disagreement is noticeably higher than in most other topics. Another interesting part of our research explored what young people believe makes someone suitable for a high responsibility role. Here we see a strong emphasis on experiences, commitment to nation and language skills, while factors like age, gender, and academic titles are considered less important. This indicates that young people value practical competence and dedication, qualities they also expect from public figures, decision makers, and political actors. Now let's turn to one of the most important themes, online political content. A striking 80% of respondents report regularly consuming online political or public affairs content. This means political communication targeting young people simply cannot ignore online platforms. Among regular consumers, we ask what types of content they actually follow. Among regular consumers, the data reveals a highly diverse mix of political content formats. The most common types are short videos and text-based content, but many young people also engage with memes, images, and infographics, podcasts, and longer video formats. This diversity illustrates that political communication today operates in a multi-channel ecosystem. Information doesn't flow through a single top-down pathway. Instead, it reaches young audiences through a wide range of formats, platforms, and intermediaries. Humorous, visual, and quick consumption content appears alongside more detailed analyses and longer explanations, together shaping how young people encounter political information. When we look at where political content actually appears, the picture becomes even clearer. Young people most often encounter such content on Facebook, followed by YouTube, online news sites, and platforms like TikTok and Instagram. Only a small share sites X or other platforms as their primary source. This distribution shows that the political information typically reaches young people through the platforms they already use daily. For many, it is not the result of deliberate searching, rather political content appears originally in their feeds, shaped by algorithms, recommendation system, and the dynamic of viral sharing. When young people describe what characterizes social media, their perceptions are strikingly consistent. A large majority see these platforms as places where AI-generated content is common and where false and misleading information also frequently appears. They likewise associate social media with political content and with fake or pseudonymous profiles. Despite this concerns, social media remains the most dominant space where political content is encountered. This tension between high consumption and low trust is one of the defining features of political communication today. We also looked at how young people view the presence of fake profiles in political comment sections. On average, respondents believe that about 30% of commenters under political posts are fake or not linked to real individuals. When we ask what they consider typical or fake profiles, respondents highlighted three main characteristics. Most believe that the primary purpose of such accounts is manipulation. Over 90% consider these characteristics of fake profiles. A large majority, 81%, also associate them with expressing extremist or highly polarizing political views. In addition, 2/3 thinks that these profiles are likely to be supported or founded by a third party. So to sum up, this indicates that young people are generally aware of manipulation attempts in online political discussions. They recognize that not all voices in these debates are authentic, and they increasingly pay attention to the credibility and origin of the content they encounter. Overall, their perception reflects a growing demand for transparency and authenticity in the digital public sphere. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Georgina. This sets us up for our first panel discussion of the day on international trends. This panel will explore the global evolution of political communication, focusing on the growing role of online platforms and election campaigns. Our distinguished speakers are Brent Buchanan, President and founder of Cygnal, Jay Richards, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and Jennie Bristow, Reader in Sociology at Canterbury Christchurch University. The discussion will be moderated by Szabolcs Janik, Senior Researcher at the School of Political Science of MCC. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Szabolcs Janik, and it is a true pleasure and honor to moderate this genuine panel in which we will address international trends in political communication, both on the supply and the demand side, meaning that how younger politicians, this new generation of young politicians communicate and how the youngsters around the world could be better reached and what issues concern these young people worldwide. But before starting the discussion, I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists more deeply. So, Jennie Bristow is a reader in Sociology at Canterbury Christchurch University and an associate of the Center for Parenting Culture Studies. Her research and public commentaries focus on generations, education, and parenting culture. Jennie has authored several books, including one with her daughter, in which titled The Corona Generation, in which she examines how the lockdown policy affected teenagers who became adults in that period during the pandemic, as well as the development of parent-child relations, if I'm correct. Okay. And we also have Brent Buchanan, who is an international poster and messaging strategist who has worked in numerous political and corporate campaigns in the US. Mr. Buchanan is a founder and president of Washington-based Cygnal, an award-winning international polling, public opinion, and predictive analytics firm. He's the author of the book America's Emotional Divide, in which he explores how human emotions drive party preferences, as well as the secret of Trump's victory in 2024. Welcome, Mr. Buchanan. And we have also J. W. Richards, who is director of the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Human Flourishing and the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in American Principles and Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Jay is the author or editor of more than a dozen books, including New York Times bestsellers, Infiltrated and Indivisible. He has written numerous articles and essays on a wide range of topics of public interest in media outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal. And he's also an active contributor in national radio and TV programs in the US. Thank you, Jay, for being with us today.
Pleasure.
And now we were asked to address the international trends in this generational shift in political communication, but taking a step back, I would start with a more general question. What do you think? What are the hottest public issues that currently concern young people around the world? Do you see any regional trends or differences in this?
Which order do we want to go in? Just I can start.
You can
because if I go last, you'll have said everything I could possibly say. Well, there are a number of polls. There's certainly a UNICEF poll. There's a kids' rights poll done by Erasmus University of global trends. If you're just wondering in terms of, if given a poll, what do, say, 10 to 18 or 18 to 21-year-olds, what do they say they're interested in? They're going to give you something, right? And so it's going to be something like economic insecurity. It might be loneliness. In continental Europe, at least, climate change and climate change anxiety rank very highly. By the way, that doesn't rank really all that highly among Americans. Certainly not conservative Americans, but that figures prominently. But I also think that might give us a false picture that young people actually have very settled opinions about particular political issues, which I think is largely true, at least of a subset of people that are Gen X or boomers. So in other words, it's sort of the 50 and over. I think that's not actually the real story, though. I think the real story, it's easier to see in, for instance, a recent book by Jonathan Haidt, an American sociologist, wrote a book called The Anxious Generation. And he talks about the great rewiring of American childhood. And this is, I think, broadly true in the developed world, including, of course, Hungary, which is the vast amount of information that is acquired via social media. So smartphones, so three key technologies. Smartphones, which only began in 2007. High-speed internet in the developed world, that was 2010. And so what that means is that if you're 18 or 20 years old, you've lived most of your life with access to information in this way. I was already an adult with a graduate degree before smartphones ever existed. And so as a result of that, it's not just that young people are accessing information in a different way. This is what older people think. Well, my children get things from TikTok. I got things from the Wall Street Journal, but it's sort of similar content. But no, this simply isn't true. And I think some of my other panelists will describe these things in more detail. It's not just that young people are receiving information through a different medium, a different message. It's that the medium itself has an effect on the user. And this is something that I myself didn't realize initially. I was worried, I had children, worried about things like online porn, radical extremism, in other words, concern about the content, and not attending to the way in which the content is delivered. So with social media, we have things like infinite scroll technology. In other words, you can continue to absorb content that's algorithm derived simply by scrolling without end. Newspapers, even large newspapers, aren't infinite, right? You can't keep doing that, and it's fixed. It's not determined by user preference. And so that Jonathan Haidt, in his book *The Anxious Generation*, I think makes a very compelling case that this simply does different things to your brain, especially if you're a child or an adolescent, than if you had not had any of that technology, say, until after your brain had fully developed. I actually think that's sort of the real story here. It's not simply, okay, how do young people think about policy issues and cultural issues compared to older generations, but the ways in which they attach to ideas and the way in which their brains are wired are different. And then finally, the speed of change of ideas is something that I don't think older generations quite understand. I mean, every time and place has noticed the difference between, the older generation and the younger generation. I think it's much, much more radical now, and you see this in some political and public opinion surveys in which certain ideas, especially extremist ideas, that are non-existent with older generations, actually there's a sizable percentage of young people, or Gen Z, which will hold views completely out of keeping. And we're seeing that. Certainly, I spend my time mostly in the conservative space of the United States, between younger conservatives and older conservatives, just radically different ideas. This could only happen because of the information transfer that happens at roughly the speed of light with social media.
When we talk issues and what people say concerns them, it really doesn't get to why does that concern them. And I think there's no different from when any of us in this room were 18 years old and somebody who's 18 years old today. You want meaning and you want opportunity. And there is more competition for meaning than there's ever been. And I think social media has also created a false sense of what meaning and success looks like. And economically, the opportunities are so much more challenging now than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. I mean, you think back to a 30-year-old when I was born, 1984, compared to a 30-year-old today, and less than half comparatively are married that were married 40 years ago, significantly less own a home. And I think the most commonality that we see all over the world with youth right now is that they want the system to work for them, and the system is broken. And not only is it broken for their ability to succeed, they actually feel it's working against them. And that creates a very different environment in which people choose to engage, how they engage, and why they engage, when they feel like they're working against a system, not just working to advance and promote a system. And I think that the conversation that needs to be had is these institutions that were built after the Second World War no longer serve anybody under the age of 50. And for most people, they actually make it harder to find meaning and to create opportunity for yourself.
Yes, I agree that meaning is the key issue, really, and that's what's coming to the fore now with the rise of populist politics in general. And I think that, generational research tends to show that there's less difference between older people and younger people, or between the generations on political issues or social issues, moral values, attitudes, than is often assumed. And I think that's true now. I think the same things that are driving, in general, the kind of populist pushback are also informing young people's ideas, so whether they're more or less radical, or you mentioned the difference between older conservatives and younger conservatives. But I think, in general, things are being thrown up into the air, okay? So I would say I think we need to be careful about drawing too many hard and fast distinctions between young people and older people. I do have some differences with Haidt's thesis in this respect. I think the great rewiring idea, it tends to feed into a very old idea that there's somehow something very different about the kids, or very different about these kids. It's almost like they're a species apart and all of this, and it's because of this thing that's happened with technology. I'm not sure if it's so clear-cut. I think the impact on social media has obviously been quite important for society and does speak kind of on an everyday intuitive level to young people. But often when, for example, people say, oh, there's a problem with young people's consumption of media, and they say, oh, it's social media, so they can't concentrate, or it's fake news, or it's very polarised. What is often being said is that young people have become detached from the mainstream organisations and channels, which speaks to what you're saying. And actually, if you look at, Georgina's research kind of indicated this, there's quite a lot of interest in long form, particularly podcasts, amongst young people. It's not that they're just tuning in for sound bites. I thought with, Charlie Kirk's assassination, it was very interesting. Somebody in the mainstream media said to me, that they were really struck by everybody under 30 in the UK had heard of him, and very few people over 30. So even if people didn't agree with him, he was a phenomenon. And that kind of search for discussion and meaning and debate, I think, is one of the good sides of the new media and the new kind of political environment that it's expressing.
Turning to the younger generation's willingness to participate in political processes, how do you see? Are they open to that, based on partly what you said, and maybe some polls or surveys, or what is the big picture like? Are they interested at all in public issues?
My sense is that it's a sort of paradoxical answer. On the one hand, there's an enormous amount of interest in public issues, including sort of the political issues among young people. And in fact, there's sort of a lot of data to suggest that. And so if you're looking for political engagement, social engagement, you're going to see that and say, okay, that's a really good thing. But I say it's paradoxical, and the reason I think it's paradoxical is because many young people's political expression, it doesn't manifest itself the way that older generations would think of it. And so, for instance, if you ask someone over 50, okay, is someone politically engaged, that would be, do they vote? Are they a member of a political party? Would they go to a political event or a political rally? You're not going to see that as highly among younger rather than older generations. What you're going to see is activity online, something some people call sort of ritual politics or performative politics. So the kind of thing that can be sort of naturally done in the sort of strongest form, of course, in long-form podcasts, but more frequently and commonly for the average, say, 18-year-old, it's going to be something on Instagram or on TikTok. So it's a type of activism. I mean, I think of Greta Thunberg, for instance, in some ways sort of is the paradigmatic example of this, except of course she's a worldwide known figure, but activity, which in a sense shows engagement and concern and worry, but it isn't necessarily channeled into something concrete, or at least as concrete as I think probably older generations would think, so that you could say both. Okay, the average 18-year-old is much more engaged in a sense in particular political causes or even activism, but yes, slightly less engaged when it comes to sort of forming durable coalitions or something like that.
Yes, it's mobilisation is interesting. I mean, we had this. We saw this in the UK around the Brexit vote. That years and years have been a discussion about, people are detached from politics. We need to engage them, and then Brexit happens. Oh no, and I think we see that a lot in the response to young people as well. I think you're right. I think there is this comes back to the mainstream institutions aren't working for anybody, and so I don't think that we'll be seeing youth getting involved in that kind of instrumental way that we've seen, and I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think the mainstream politics has become very depoliticised. So that's not a bad thing, and I do think young people. My impression, as somebody who engages with young people teaching all the time, is I think that they are kind of aware and interested in kind of issues. There's also a troubling side of the activism. I'm thinking of Antifa, and then on the other side, actually elements of the cultural right, where there is a kind of a move to sort of passion and meaning and activism without reflection, thought, and I think it's trying to kind of, we need to get a balance on that, because, passion for causes is very good, but it needs to be balanced with a kind of a responsibility for thinking through what it is you're trying to do, and a kind of an awareness that we live in a pluralist democratic society. It's not just about kind of making your point.
Yeah, that's a lot of why I just wrote this book that came out last week, America's Emotional Divide, because if you understand what people are feeling, then it's a lot easier to have that conversation and meet them where they are. The problem with just focusing on the top line issues are that those are going to change, and they change more rapidly. I mean, what is the news cycle now? It used to be a week, and then 24 hours and 24 minutes and 24 seconds. And so if you're not understanding the underlying aspect of why that issue has popped up, and I think that's one of the broader challenges that older generations were brought up on, that this world is for us, and younger generations and the content that they see is this world is about me. And I think that's one of the largest challenges that youth have right now, is that they believe that the world is about them and for them. And so it affects the way that they engage politically, that they're less about, to your point, being part of a party. They're less about even being about a politician. They see those as vehicles for themselves as opposed to vehicles for broader change. And I think that's why you see these huge swings in participation among the youth in elections. So, young men essentially elected Donald Trump, and mostly non-white young men. Not a constituency you would think would go vote for a Republican, but yet they did. And we have seen a complete falling off of that audience from Donald Trump in less than a year. Why? Because they didn't get what they expected out of it. And so that is impacting when and how they engage, if they feel that the time horizon that you're given to affect change is so short now. And it's one of the largest challenges for any party that's in charge anywhere in the world, and why we saw the year of 2024 essentially every party lost. If you were in charge, you lost in 2024 in most of the world. Why? Because people had been fed up that the change didn't come. And I think you're going to see even more pendulum swings politically because of the youth. Our firm has said for a long time that people under 40 are going to determine elections moving forward. And it's not just the mathematical that they become a larger portion of the electorate. It is that when they show up, they make a massive impact, and when they don't show up, they make a massive impact. But it's all driven by that me-centric world that you live in, when all you do is scroll, and the world I see on my phone is different than the world you see on your phone. It's different than the world you see on your phone. And so what does that mean for participating in activism when every one of our worlds is different now?
You all mentioned the appreciating role of the social media in terms of the participation of youngsters. How do you see, can this popularity and this heavy presence on social media solve the issue of youngsters somehow being channeled into public issues, public discourse? Can it be a final solution to this kind of apathy witnessed all around the world, including among the youth? What do you think, and what can be the future, or what could be the ways of development for this heavy social media presence in terms of public participation?
I don't know honestly, if you'd asked me this 10 years ago, I think my view might have been different. I think I was probably much more on the techno-optimist side. I'm not a pessimist, but I'm more on the techno-realist side, I suppose. And so it's hard for me to think of a problem for which social media is the solution at the moment. There may be something I'm sort of not thinking of, but we have talked a bit about that. The sort of key factor that we've all referred to briefly that I want to just make explicit is the rise of distrust in public institutions, which is, of course, fed by social media and sort of amplified. It's not the fault of social media. I mean, the reason, to put it bluntly, the reason that young people distrust public institutions is because so many public institutions have been disloyal, have not earned trust. In fact, if anything, public health authorities and political authorities have more often earned our distrust just in the United States, just to sort of isolate the US. Our public health institutions, whether it was the CDC or the FDA, the Department of Health and Human Services during COVID, told us many things that were just false. And so I think for many young people, it's not irrational to say, well, these institutions that we were told made decisions and advocated policy based upon sort of careful analysis of the evidence, lied to us over and over and over and over again. Which other institutions are lying to us as well? Now, that's healthy if it causes you to say, okay, I want to trust those institutions that are trustworthy and doubt those that are not. It's unhealthy if it leads to a kind of radical nihilism or skepticism in which you just doubt absolutely everything. Well, they lied to us about the mRNA vaccine. Maybe nobody ever went to the moon, right? I mean, this is the kind of radical skepticism that can happen, and I do think that dynamic is showing up, at least in the sort of 2024 elections. If you look at a survey that just came out actually earlier this week or last week by the Manhattan Institute, which is a conservative think tank in the United States, did a survey of Republicans who voted for Donald Trump in 2024. And it's sort of comforting for a Gen Xer like me, a traditional conservative. 2/3 of the people that voted for Donald Trump in 2024 are what they called core conservatives, conservative politically and economically and on social issues. But then 1/3 are what they call new entrant Republicans, which include the larger share of minority voters. So if the left had said Donald Trump was just for white people and he was racist, and yet a record number of Hispanic and African American voted for Donald Trump compared to previous sort of Republican presidencies or candidates. So that's very interesting. But if you look at the new entrant Republicans, that third, which includes a large share of younger voters, these are very often people that have voted for a Republican for the first time, either because they were voted for a Democrat previously or because this is their first vote. And also they're much more heterodox politically. So they may have voted for Donald Trump, but they're not actually a conservative or a right-winger. In fact, they're sort of left-wing on the traditional thinking on economics and social issues. And so that suggests this extreme volatility that someone might vote for Donald Trump in 2024 and then for whoever the sort of socialist candidate is in 2028, like we saw in New York. And then, but the other thing that is represented in these numbers is the tendency toward extremism among the younger Republicans versus the older Republicans. Now, I use this advisedly. I'm a conservative. I'm used to being called an extremist. I'm used to being called a racist. I'm called a Nazi on the street. I mean, look at me, right? So you come out of the Heritage Foundation. So there's so much false accusation of extremism by the left toward conservatives that we're, speaking as a conservative, we're sort of resistant to this. Nevertheless, there is, it's a minority, but there is a growth of what we would almost all consider extremist attitudes among some young, mostly male voters on the right. And you see that especially in anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish attitudes, which are virtually non-existent. If you talk to conservative Americans from 50 and above, anti-Jewish attitudes they're so non-existent that many people would say, I've never talked to anyone who denies the Holocaust. That's no longer true. There's a minority, mostly of males, on the terminally online right. There's a kind of a resurgence of anti-Semitic and racist attitudes. Now, I'm comforted by the fact that this is even more true on the left among young voters, strangely enough. But that's a sort of cold comfort. But I do think that's something that we simply have to take account of. This justly earned distrust of public institutions also is breeding a type of skepticism, which is sort of the seedbed from which some genuinely extremist attitudes can emerge. And that, to me, that's a massive gap between the young and the old, and we see that even among the Trump voters in 2024.
I don't think social media is social anymore. Think back to the Facebook. It was literally to take your face off of a piece of paper and put it into an online version where now you could write an update. That was social media. Now social media is just video content distribution platforms. There's nothing social about TikTok. TikTok is a content platform, but it's called social media. And I think that's one of the largest misnomers when we try to talk about how is social media impacting politics? Well, it did. Under Obama, it was social media, and he used it to socialize ideas and votes. And now social media is just simply, how do I get video content in front of somebody? It's no different than turning on a television and watching the news. You're just doing it 400 clips over 30 minutes doing this, is to your point, Jay, earlier. And so when we look at, quote, social media, really it's just online content consumption is all it is now. There's no more social aspect to it, which is why I think it's one of the large drivers of why we have lost community with each other. Because for that beginning of when it was social media, it was online community. But online community doesn't really exist anymore in the same way. And so the ability to socialize ideas through it have died. You have to just be really good at pushing out content. And so as opposed to us going to find information, like I'm going to go read a newspaper and choose which articles I read, now the information is chosen for you. And I think the broader discussion needs to be about the algorithms and the company, these content companies we call social media companies. And if youth are going to engage on this, it is going to be through viral video content, not through socializing with each other on an online platform anymore.
Yeah, I really agree with you, Jay, on the difference between a kind of earned distrust or even healthy scepticism on the one hand, and then this spillover into this sort of nihilism, on both left and right. And I think the question about the community versus social media, what comes first, is an interesting one. I mean, did we lose community and then that's why we've got social media? I mean, that was certainly one of the problems with the lockdowns, that everyone was like forced online and, conspiracy theories went wild. Young people particularly, locked in their bedrooms. I mean, nobody could have had ethics approval to conduct that kind of experiment, right? And get that unfiltered, thing. And I think I do think it's interesting because I think what social media offers is the ability to, and I take your point about content production, but the fact that people can kind of, at least in theory, speak for themselves, they can create their own content. The discussion about young people for such a long time, one of my previous books, I was writing largely about the millennials, and the discussion about the voice of youth, which is really basically the voice that older people want young people to say. It was the voice of conformity, putting words into the mouths of babes, as we say. I think that's changed now because I think this is the byproduct of young people going off in all of these directions. Nobody knows how to control it, but nobody sort of dares to kind of say we're speaking on their behalf anymore. So this is a very interesting moment. The problem, I think, this comes back to the community point with the social media or whatever we call it, is that it's unbounded, it's very globalized. I mean, in the UK, we see this particularly. There's always been a kind of strange fusion of, we call it Anglo-American culture. So young British youth take a lot from America that isn't, it's American, it's not British. Their understanding of race, for example, or gender attitudes, which are quite different in the two countries. The reason we call them Gen Z in the UK, my students corrected me on this. When I said Generation Z, they're like, what are you talking about? But they knew Gen Z. So, and the generation labels themselves are Americanized categories. So it can, if it's just that and not grounded in your kind of daily lives and communities, it can give a very strange sense of what's going on, and it can make people desensitized to the responsibilities and the interactions with others. So I do think, in relation to young people, we do need to really think about sounds very old-fashioned, bringing the real world into play as well, and having the conversations with young people, not shying away from it, not assuming they're just online and they're not thinking and listening, but really properly, energetically engaging young people in those real world conversations.
We see more and more young opinion leaders appearing mostly in social media, influencers and other media personalities who are very popular among the youth. How can they involve or engage young people in public issues, in political processes? Are youngsters more open to these players in the media? How do you see their roles?
And so you're referring to sort of social media influencers rather than the politicians themselves, right? So, I mean, the answer is clearly yes. I mean, there's sort of irony that in an age of TikTok and Instagram reels, right, which are very, very short, or even X, right, in which even though they're twice as long, the posts as they used to be are quite brief. We also live in this moment of long-form podcasts, which can go from 1 to 3 hours, right, simultaneously. And so I think all of these technologies in some ways conform to what's often called the Matthew principle, is a sort of term that we use in the United States, which is, to him whom much is given, he will receive much more, but he who has little, even what he has will be taken away. So in other words, if you know how to do research already, using a chatbot is magical, right? Because it can find you a bibliography almost immediately. If you don't know how to do that and you don't know how to write, it becomes an amazing cheating tool for not learning anything at all. And I think it's the same thing now. There's an amazing amount of content by social media influencers and podcasters. I am an avid consumer of these things, both political and sociological and religious and fitness, right? And at the same time, this is the primary vector for some of the most toxic ideas, certainly in the United States. I mean, we're in the middle of this, I don't know what to call it, but this is sort of massive controversy over this guy named Nick Fuentes in the U.S., and Candace Owens, who was a sort of normal conservative influencer, it seems like 5 days ago, and just seems to be getting, frankly, crazier and crazier by the day. And then more mainstream social media influencers or I don't know what, sort of not journalists, but sort of commentators like Tucker Carlson, who is sort of in this middle, sort of conservative, little contrarian, again, kind of more and more extreme content. And so the sort of irony here is that among young people, there can be at the same time an extreme skepticism about the information coming from what is perceived as an official source. Right, so okay, well, we know that the sort of official sources lie to us, but then actually, an extreme gullibility about the sort of non-official or sort of edgy sources. So it's a kind of selective skepticism, and so it's not simply that the sort of short-form social media or digital platforms. I'm not going to say social media anymore. That those can have a negative effect, but despite the promise and the benefits of some of the kind of social media influencers to deliver content, it also, I think, is a disease vector for the bad stuff.
In this world where you essentially receive the information that confirms what you already believe, which is why I think you see these kind of further and further right and extreme views, is because there are people who have those views. They're not seeing a video and deciding they have that view. They have that view so they see the video. And it's one of the reasons that I think Donald Trump was so successful in 2024 and why he's struggling right now, is he was constantly on podcasts. Well, I don't even know why we call them that. YouTube videos that you can listen to also. He was having long, authentic conversations on all kinds of topics. And he was coming across as very relatable. And now he seems very insular and separated because he's only talking to journalists and he's going from an interview to an interrogation. You don't control the conversation when you're answering journalist responses, but you do when you're on a long-form podcast, because you can choose not to answer that question and talk for 20 minutes about whatever you want, and then the host takes the conversation that direction also. And so I say all of this, that if you're a politician or a political party or a movement or a belief, and you don't have an active strategy to have your own influencers driving conversation, then you have the conversation driven for you. And I think Donald Trump is finally realizing that when he was in control of the conversation, things were going well, and when he was not, when he was reacting and responding, is when things don't go well. So when you ask the question about being involved in how do influencers, are they political, or then everything's political now. And not being political is a statement, a political statement in and of itself. And so you just have to realize that and be very heavily invested into driving your own content through these, or you're going to have the content driven onto you like a Nick Fuentes or a Candace Owens.
Yes, indeed. Everything's political. I mean, what's happening in the current moment is that culture has become politicised. That's why it's the culture wars, which is why we need to take it all very seriously. But it is difficult because it means that discussions are simultaneously, they're about ideas, they're about principles, they're about yourself, your identity, your neighbour. Everything. They're about language, they're about meaning. And so there is a kind of a need, I think, to try and inject some more sobriety into some of these discussions where we can. I think, you know, and I would say, but by not leaving it to particular influencers. I mean, I think that's also a tendency to sort of go, oh, well, this person's popular, and either, well, oh, they're popular, what can we do? Or we need to be like them. You know, everybody's chasing the algorithm, right? And you know, the legacy media as well. You know, mainstream book publishing, whatever. You know, so it's a kind of a product of a sort of a lack of confidence, and everyone wants to get in on the game. And I think we should be kind of, I mean, by we I mean kind of older people. Speak for myself. Yeah, we should be kind of asserting our authority and responsibility over debate more. I think we should also be doing some more genuine listening to young people and maybe trusting them. I mean, again, to refer to Georgina's opening comments about her research, a lot of people know that there's bots out there, that things are fake. You know, young people are quite savvy, and Gen Z has got a sense of humour. It's very dark. I don't understand it, but at least they've got one. And I think sometimes older generations take it all much more literally. And then they read into things, what we're reading into them, rather than what young people are taking from them. So I think having the conversation constantly will be a way of doing these two things, kind of setting some correctives where they need to be corrected, but also understanding actually what's going on, because I don't understand it. This is not a context that I grew up in.
How does the communication of young politicians differ compared to the older but still active politician generation? Maybe in the West or globally, but do you see any difference, because you can see them at the same time and you can compare them, how a politician in his 30s and how a politician in his 70s communicate, and which can better appeal to young voters? To me, logically, the former, but how do you see, and do they have any role in mobilizing, in engaging the youth, these traditional politicians?
I think Donald Trump nailed it with his 2024 campaign. He's almost 80 years old, but he chose to be everywhere and go on everything and have the conversations. Another politician that I think does this very well and is older is Prabowo Subianto, the new president of Indonesia. He, being an old guy who was a defense minister, everybody knew who he was, knows he's part of the ruling families there in Indonesia. But they made lots of content about him being like this lovable uncle. And there were memes and anime drawings and videos all about Uncle Prabowo. And so you don't have to be young to use these mediums. You just have to be yourself to be on these mediums. And I think that's one of the genuine benefits of long-form content, is that you get to see much more holistically somebody than you can in a 30-second television ad or in a flyer or even in a radio interview. And so because of these content tools that we have available, I don't think age really matters as much. But I do guarantee that both Prabowo in Indonesia listened to somebody younger who said, hey, you should probably do this, as much as Donald Trump listened to Alex Brusiewicz and his son Barron Trump, who said, hey, you should probably go on these podcasts. They're not going to come up with the idea because, to your point, that's not the context of which they grew up. But if somebody can explain to them, here's the benefit, here's the opportunities, here's the risks, do you want to go for it? I think that's what a lot of older politicians are finally realizing. And those who are not authentic people, who are just master politicians at the old system, come across as cringe almost if they try it. So if you have the right personality for it and the right authenticity, then you can master and excel with those platforms. But they're much more revealing of who a person really is than the old mediums were.
And what's interesting about Donald Trump, and people sort of forget this, is he seems, or certainly in 2024, he mastered the digital platform game. But he had mastered another game before that, television, right? The guy was the central figure of a very popular network TV show for what, a decade? I mean, I never, honestly, I may have seen one episode, but he mastered that particular medium, which is absolutely crucial. If you couldn't master television in sort of one moment, you couldn't succeed. And I think it's an easy prediction is that future politicians that are successful are going to have to master these sort of constantly changing media tools. Trump, as you said, did it very well. He does very well in these long-form interview podcasts. And again, I mean, it's another example of what these kinds of sort of social media phenomena, what they reveal. Trump, in a 3-hour interview, it's like, okay, yeah, he's not the sort of monster we heard, and he's actually very funny, and he can have nice conversations. Kamala Harris, this was a disaster, right? Even an hour, and it's like, oh no, get her, turn the camera off, right? What's happening? And so these forums can actually reveal things that are there, as well as distort them. That's why I constantly think about, these things are gifts. They can be beneficial. They can also be profoundly disastrous.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not about being young or old. And one of the tragedies of what has happened to political discussions about youth and politics until the current awakening of politics in this crazy way that we're all experiencing was this idea that your generational location denoted your political outlook. In other words, young people all thought like this, and what they needed was somebody to represent them who was also young. And we know that this is a nonsense, okay? And also, young people hate it. I mean, this is anecdotal, but a few years ago, I asked a bunch of students, what they thought of Greta Thunberg. I mean, this came up, as it was always being held up as this shining beacon of political activism, and they were really cross. And the reason was not because they disagreed with her necessarily, but it was like this idea that she's being held up as like a beacon of them and what they should be. And it was almost like, this has got nothing to do with us. We have, they weren't political, these students. And so I think that there's a sort of, I think there's been an alienating effect to young people about attempts to kind of wave all of these kind of, respectable political young people in their faces and say, be like that, this person represents you. As I said, Gen Z, they've got a sense of independence, they've got a sense of humour, they'll just go, nah, and choose somebody who they want to listen to and argue with.
And my final question would be, do you have any idea how to better engage young people in political processes? What is the responsibility, the role of the media, the political elite, the society itself? Do you have any ideas about that or suggestions that could be somehow implemented in the future in order to better meet the democratic principle?
I really want to hear what Brent has to say to this question, because this is not my area to sort of give advice. I will say one interesting thing we hadn't discussed that's in the data of the sources I've cited, this New Manhattan Institute survey, Jonathan Haidt's book, and several other recent surveys, is the role of serious religious belief and practice on political views. That doesn't mean automatically that if you're religious, you're going to be a conservative or you're going to be on the left. But there is a very strong signal when it comes to the really toxic stuff that's online, racism and anti-Semitism and deeply anti-female attitudes, right? Not just sort of traditionalism, of course, but genuinely misogynistic attitudes. Is that among young people, the more religious they are, as graded by active participation, weekly or more than weekly attendance at worship, for instance, is protective against these things. So contrary to the kind of mainstream media lie that, religious belief is itself kind of a source of extremism, actually on the bad extremism, it seems to be the primary protector. If you're deeply religious, you're going to be much less likely to hold these toxic beliefs, at least in the West.
Yes, I think part of the reason for my kind of being relatively positive about some of the shifts in new media, I think going back to proper journalism is would be a good start. Because I think that if you have a kind of a spirit of just some editorial standards, so if the media stopped talking about itself and to itself and just recycling prejudices, which is what and the mainstream media in the UK does this, but actually following that kind of principle of proper investigation, talking to people, finding out what's going on, I think that will be a really good way of strengthening and deepening the culture of, the political ideas and the conversations that we can have. I think that's probably logically and chronologically prior to looking to rescue political institutions, because that has a long way to go. I mean, populism as a moment is still in its infancy, and there's going to be all kinds of problems going forwards. But I think, we can look to decent journalism and, what it used to be when it was about trying to seek the truth and tell the truth.
And I think to that point, those institutions got used to telling people what they're supposed to believe. And the younger generations don't want to hear that at all. They want to hear your perspective and then make their own decision from it. And because they have so much information at their fingertips, they have the ability to go quickly see what the other side is saying about that particular point. And so if we're going to engage youth more, we have to start by actually listening to them. This is one of my favorite things about doing survey research work, is getting to hear what somebody's opinion is. And as I've gotten older, I've realized that it's not about what they tell you. It's the same as being married. The first thing your wife said is not actually what she means. It's the next thing and the next thing that is what she actually means. And if you stop at the first thing, you never know what she actually means. And the same thing with engaging youth. And I think that they are more equipped to have these conversations than youth of past generations because of all that they have access to. But we've got to understand what are the why drivers behind all of that in the first place. And so as I've gotten older doing research, I've realized that I really like qualitative research. I love conducting focus groups. I really enjoy open-ended questions within surveys, not boxing people into response options. And then we even developed a tool at our firm called Heartbeat, where we can go in and quantify the qualitative emotions behind each of these responses. And so one really unique finding of the last couple months in our regular national survey is that we had college-educated voters moving towards Republicans, which is anti-trend of the last 30 years. And it was actually because of the illegal immigration issue. But it was, if you go behind why that was happening, it was that they appreciated the pressure being taken off of the systems, the hospitals, the education system, the housing supply. And you would have never gotten to that if you asked their top issue, because they would have never told you illegal immigration, because that's not what college-educated people care about. And so going to how do we engage the youth is we have to ask them that question. We can't sit up here and give the answer and say this is what you do to engage the youth, because it's going to be different in the context and the issue and the outcome that you're driving towards. But it starts by actually having conversations and hearing from them without filter to be able to answer that question.
Thank you very much, all of you, for sharing these excellent thoughts. I think we couldn't have hoped for a better start to this genuine conference, so thank you very much for that. Thank you for following us, and I encourage you to stay with us also after the short break that's coming now, and have a very good and fruitful inquiry into this broader topic. Thank you very much.